Music theory with OneNote. Traveling in the negative direction over an octave. Scale degree intervals versus modal distance. Spoiler alert, scale degree intervals, like concepts from the woke wicked witch of the West, fall apart completely upon contact with water. However, it is quite entertaining to watch them bubble up and, fade away into mist. So we got that to look forward to. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with OneNote, it's a beautiful note. You're not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of Modal Node System, MNS, Presentation 1253, OneNote, negative over an octave scale degree intervals versus modal distance, list of presentations, which we plan on adding plenty more to shortly. Also note, within this OneNote presentation, we can spend all of our time looking at music theory, but we have a similarly numbered and named presentation where we build these tables in Excel, practicing music, and practicing table visualization at the same time. We're going to continue to look at our intervals, which is our distance notation, but it also has a directionality component, remembering that the standard intervals we use do a decent job with distance, but a very bad job with directionality. So we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to propose a different idea for measuring the intervals and expand that into a negative direction as well as a negative direction over an octave, which again is a place, an area where the standard system really basically falls apart. Let's first go over our analogy as we think about this. We've been adding basically levels of complexity as we think about our intervals and how we can be measuring them. Remember, we can basically see the fretboard as a map. It is a territory. We would like to label the items on the territory similar to the world, saying that we have 7 destination locations. We have then 5 non-destination locations, non-continents like oceans that we're going through to get to the destination locations. We're going to imagine ourselves in space over the top of the fretboard, over the top of this low or heavy E string. And as we look at the fretboard, we imagine it's rotating around like the continents in the world rotating around. We would then have 12 degrees of rotation that we're going to assign that tie to the 12 notes in the musical alphabet, typically working in the degree number 4, collection of 7 notes, 7 continents from the degree number 4 here. But remember, we could go to 5 or C sharp, D, D sharp, E, and the whole world would rotate. All the relative positions would be the same. So the intervals that we're working on apply to all of the 12 notes and rotations, or 12 collections of notes, and to all of the 7 different modal center points or scales within them, or modes within them. So once we know that, we no longer want to name all of our positions by the note names. And I have an analogy I've been working on to better explain that, because if you imagine that we wrap the fretboard around the world, that would be like we had a grid around the world, which would basically be latitude and longitude. And you can imagine that if we take that grid off the world and we keep it static as we're up in space looking at the world, and we named all the latitude and longitude on the grid, but then when the world spun, we're going to imagine that I'd have to follow around Asia, and it's going to have a different latitude and longitude as it's spinning around from our perspective in space, because the grid that we laid on is not rotating with the planet. That would be similar to the note names. That's, of course, not what we want for optimal ability to navigate around. I want the latitude and longitude to be on the actual surface of the planet, rotating with the planet, and then from my perspective in space, I decide which degree of rotation I'm looking in, and then I can always have the same latitude and longitude, right? So that's what we're doing here. We're deciding what key we're in, what's the 7 collection of notes, and then I want to measure from there the names of the continents, which would be the Nashville number system, Ionian, is the 1, Phrygian is the 3, Aeolian is the 6, and so on and so forth. Now, we can also vision this, that we don't have to go left and right and so on for directions to get to, say, North America to Australia, because we imagine it's going around in a track, a block system, or a racetrack, and therefore all we need is directionality and distance. We have the two distance terms. One, if I go clockwise, is going continent to continent, which would be similar to modal half step to modal half step. So if I go from, let's go from this 3 to this 5, it would be 1, 2 continents up, which I would say is equivalent to modal half steps up. The scale degree term is similar, but it measures wrong, right? It measures from here. So it'd be 1, 2, 3. It would be the third. But we also have directionality. So I could go backwards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 modal half steps backwards, or 5 continents backwards. If I made that the 1, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. -6 scale degrees. Problem is, we don't really use scale degrees going backwards because it doesn't really make sense, because the measurement tool was off, and therefore we kind of lose the ability to apply the concept of that measuring tool going backwards. However, if we fix the measuring to measure from that point, then it works perfectly going backwards. And that's one of the things that we will take a look at here. Now, whether we're going clockwise or counterclockwise, it's a little bit more difficult than the racetrack analogy, because we also have the ability to go up octave-wise. So we really want to see this as a 3D type of surface, so that we can actually go on a number line up infinitely, back infinitely on a note number line, or we can take infinite laps around the circle that's really kind of a spiral. It repeats and has directionality. My new concept there is basically time. So if I was to go this way, let's say we count the notes as well. We're going to say, let's go backwards. We're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to get to this 7. So it would be -5 notes backwards. Now, we also can go around the block. So that would be 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So that means that I could have a distance of going all the way around the block, and we have the local distance. So you might call the local distance 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which would be equivalent to the notes backwards. But then I could have the local distance and an octave. And the octave you can imagine as a third dimension like time, which would be the time equivalent to go another lap around the block, right? So that could give us our other dimension, could be time, with our analogy, which would be equivalent to going an octave up. We still have the local distance, which I would like to name because that still gives us our flavor, but then we can say it's another octave, up, which would be equivalent to the time it takes to take another lap around to get to that same local distance. All right, that's the analogy. So what we've done in the past is we've taken our notes, 12 notes. We're working in the key of C, meaning we applied the formula from the key of C, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. Here's going to be our 7 notes. We applied our Nashville number system and our mode identifications here. We then first started thinking about all intervals that go clockwise in one direction from any one particular point. That means we have 11 steps up from that point that we can take, and we use the normal naming convention, which is naming in, I would add the notes, scale degree, and then gives this third factor as to whether it's in the major scale, meaning if you start on a node, the Ionian node, will it land you on a continent or not, is basically what this is measuring. We then said, well, what if I go backwards? And we saw that it totally falls apart if we go backwards, because you would think if I go backwards, it would be a negative second scale degree, which you don't normally do. So that means we had to kind of shoehorn the system to work, saying I'm still going to use the flavor term as though I'm going clockwise, but I'm going to add directionality of the negative notes. And that's, I think, the clearest way to give yourself directionality with the current term. But as you can see, it completely falls apart from the scale degree side of things, because the scale degrees don't really work because they started on the 1 instead of the 0. So if they would have started on 0, it works. And so that's what we'll basically do. And then we went up past an octave and say, what do we do if we go past an octave? And instead of using compound scale degrees, which I'll talk about later, meaning if I go up to this major third, I could call it a major tenth, which would be 7 plus the 3, a major tenth. But I'd rather keep the major third because that's what most people do on the guitar. I'd like to see all of the different major thirds as the flavor of a major third, and then add the idea of always saying that it's a 16 note away major third. You can also say it's a major third plus an octave, but I think the best way to do it is to say it's a 4 note plus an octave, or a 4 plus 12 major third, or a 16 note away major third, because that'll allow you to map it out on the fretboard. But you can't do compound intervals going backwards. So if I go backwards over an octave, we ran into the same problem of, well, I can't make this a negative major tenth or something, right? Because the scale degrees fall apart going backwards. So we kind of have to use the local distance as though we're going clockwise, but then tack on that we're in the negative direction to add directionality. That's where we left off. Now we're going to do the more logical thing, which is to try to say, okay, let me use a measurement system that properly measures going forward and backward from the node that we are on, which is a system that's more likely to have come up if we were to build it with all the tools that we currently have on the table, instead of kind of piecing things together throughout history and trying to stick with all the rules that got put together as time passed when they didn't have all the tools on the table. All right, so for example, let's say we're going to go back. Let's say we go back here 12. So we're going to go negative 12 distance backwards. And so normally I'd have to say, okay, if I go back 12, that would be like, I can see that's an octave back because it's 12 or above. 12 minus 12 would bring me to 0. So that's going to be like a perfect first or negative in the negative octave direction. I would like to call that instead to say that it's going to be a modal range of, let's say, an II. Now I can measure these from any of the nodes here, right? I can measure from any node and you can go through them and check them all out, but I'll just test out a couple of them. So let's say that we're on this Ionian node right here, and we're going to say if it was the local distance, I would travel 0. It wouldn't be going anywhere. It would be an II. But I'm going to say that would be an II distance from a modal range distance or a 1-1 distance. But I want to go negative 12. So how can I go negative 12? Well, there's 5 notes between the strings, so it's going to be 5, 10, 11, 12. So here's the negative 12 distance. So I'd like to call that a modal range of an II and negative 12. So that's going to give me the directionality on the negative side for the modal range, and that I'm going above an octave. And so, or I can call it a 1-1 from a Nashville number system and a negative 12. And the distance is going to be, I would say, a negative 12 from the Ionian node, which would be the zeroist modal half step. This second term being the local distance. So I'm going to do the same thing we did over here. I'm going to keep the local distance because that's going to give us the flavor. And then I'm going to say the note distance in order to give me that added dimension, which is equivalent to time. And so that would mean, so if I wanted the local distance from here, I'd have to say 12 minus 12, which would be to 0, which would be the 0 note away Ionian zeroist modal half step, which would be the first modal half step. All right, now that one's usually it kind of makes the most sense, and also is kind of like the most confusing because that's like not going in. If it was in, it would be equivalent to not going anywhere if it was on the zeroist step. So let's go to the next one up. We can go back 13 from any point on the fretboard, but let's imagine we go back from the Ionian node. So we're going to go negative 13 from the Ionian node. It's over 12. It's over an octave in the negative direction. So we can ask, what would be the local distance? It would be 13 minus 12, which would be negative 1 from the Ionian node, which would be a negative first modal half step backwards, remembering that that negative is flowing through to both of the numbered terms. If we're going negative first modal half step backwards, you would think it would be the negative second scale degree, but we don't have negative scale degrees. That's part of our problem. But if I look at it up here, I can say if I go 1 note backwards and 1 modal half step backwards, we get to the Locrian node. that's an IN modal range or a 1-7 modal range, but we're going in the counterclockwise direction. Now I want to go back 13. So if I went back 13 from here, that would be -1 minus an octave, -1 minus 12 or 13 Ionian, and then I'm going to keep the local distance in modal half steps of the first. So if I go back 13, it's going to be 5 notes between the strings, so 5, 10, 11, 12, 13. So you can still see it's still going to be an IN modal range. So we had an IN modal range. Whoops, that's the wrong one here. But now it's going to be an IN and a -12, showing me the directionality between these 2 points going in the negative direction, and that we're adding an octave, or a 1-7 and -12. Nashville number system, 1 to 7 in the local negative direction, and then this is 1 to 7 with the negative direction with an added 12 or octave in the middle. Now note that this second term, I could have done the same thing as we did with the notes, because unlike with the scale degrees, we measured it properly, so we could have similar concept of a scale degree or compound interval going forward. As sometimes you'll see in a textbook going forward, instead of calling this a 16 note away major third, you might see it called a major 10, which would be 7 plus 3, a major 10th. But it falls apart going backwards because of the measurement problem. But here we could go in the negative direction and say that we're going to have a -1 plus 7 or a -8th. So it can be a -13 note away from the Ionian node, -8th modal half step, and then we can count the modal half steps going backwards. Now we'll do that method in a future presentation. That could be a little bit tighter of something to say because you could drop the notes and just use the modal half steps. But I think it's better to say the notes because then you get the total distance and you get this term, which still gives you the flavor. Now, note that we can also see this directionality going forward, right? So we can say that the local distance is a 1 note away Ionian first, or we can see here that it's just an Ionian first, right? A 13 note away Ionian first. So what would be the directionality if I went clockwise? I could take this second term and say it's going to be 7 minus 1, which would be 6. So it would be an 11 note away Ionian 6, right? So that would be, so if I went forwards, I have to go across the fault line. So it's 5 notes here, 5, 10, 11. So you can see we have a slightly different name. Some people might argue, well, if I do it this way, then I have the same name for all of the modal ranges. If I go to an IN, it's always going to be a major 7. However, the major 7 doesn't really make sense, right? It's because what you would like to be able to note is that you have directionality. So you had to kind of shoehorn directionality in place. Here we see the directionality. We're basically going at a local distance of -1 backwards, which then we can compound by adding 12. And if we're going -1 backwards, then we're going 12 minus 1 or 11 forwards. And I can still keep the local distance, which would mean that we're going -1 backwards, which means we'd be going forward 7 minus 1 or 6 modal half steps forward. And I could compound this, give it a compound interval as well. So this actually just makes more sense logically, just from a normal kind of measuring standpoint. Now, if we did the same thing, we could measure from another area here, any of the nodes. So if we measured from this one, the Phrygian, let's say we go back 13 from the Phrygian. So let's say we measure it from here. Then again, we could say, okay, if it goes back 13 from the Phrygian, 13 minus 12 would be a -1. I'm sorry, not from the Phrygian, from the Lydian. 13 minus 12 would be a -1 from the Lydian, which would be a negative first modal half step, which you would think would be the negative second scale degree. But again, we don't have scale degrees, so we had to kind of shoehorn that term in. So that would be right here. We go from the Lydian back to the Phrygian for the local distance. But I want to go back 13. So that would be 5 notes distance between here, 10, 11, 12, 13. So now we have a local distance of a -1 Lydian negative first modal half step. And then this one is still going to be a y negative first modal half step, but now it's a 13 note away, or a -1 minus an octave, or a -1 minus 12 Lydian, but I'm still going to keep the local distance first modal half step back. If I was to go forward, I can see that I'm still going to call it a first modal half step forward. Therefore, it's going to be 7 minus 1. I'm sorry, backwards. So it can be 7 minus 1 or 6 forward. So it would be an 11 note away Lydian sixth going forward, which you would think is going to be the 7th scale degree. And this, so we could see this term actually works going forward because it's the 11th major 7th scale, 11 note away major 7th scale degree. So going forward, then it's going to be 11 notes away, which would be across the fault line 5, 10, and 11. So we have the modal range then of an FE modal range, a YP modal range, local modal range going backwards and forwards, clockwise and counterclockwise. And then if I go to this one, I'm going to add directionality saying it's and 12 or and a -12. Or I can say it's a 4-3 modal range and a -12. So this one will actually tell me more specifically what is happening because it's going to add directionality. As I say, it's going 12 in the negative direction. Okay. Next one, let's go back 14. We're going to imagine that we're going to be going back from the Phrygian this time to start off with. So here's our Phrygian items. And we're going to say we're going back 14 from the Phrygian node. So we can then ask what's going to be the local distance. Well, it's going to be over 12 in the negative direction. So 14 minus 12 would be like 4 minus 2, which would be 2. So it would be a -2 from the Phrygian node, which would be a negative first modal half step, which you would think would be the negative second scale degree if we had scale degrees, which we don't. So we have to still call it -2 minor 7 in this method. So here you can see if I go back to the local negative distance would be 1, 2 going here. So we can see then that it's a PD modal range. So we have a PD modal range, which I can also call a 3, 2 modal range. Now this is going clockwise or counterclockwise from that modal range, but there's the modal range. Now, but I want to go 14. So I'm still going to call it a -14 from the Phrygian node, but I'm going to keep the local distance backwards, which is the negative first modal half step, because that'll help keep the flavor. But I'm going to go back 14 this time, which is going to be 5 between the strings here, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So these are both going to be PD modal ranges, but I'm going to call this distance something different. I'm going to say that's going to be a PD modal range and a -12. Which will give me the directionality of the modal range and that there's going to be an octave in between it. So that's going to be the idea. Now, if I go forward, I can see that if I go 1 local modal half step backwards, 7 minus 1 would give me the forward distance, which would be 6. So you would think that would be a 10 note away from the Phrygian 6th modal half step, which would be the 7th scale degree, as you can see over here, which is the 10 note away minor 7. So you can see how that all basically pans out. So if I went 10 forward, it would be 5 notes between here because we're going up because of the fault line, and then what am I? I'm going 10 forward from this one. So it'd be 5 here and then 10. So it would be a PD modal range going forward. So we do have a different name going forward, but the name, of course, makes sense because you would think that if you're going -2, then when you go forward, it would be 12 minus 2. If you're going -1, it would be 7 minus 1 would be 6. Whereas over here, we just have to kind of memorize this second part of the equation, which isn't a benefit. That's actually a problem. That's because this second part isn't really telling us anything about the direction or the distance. All right, let's keep going up and do another one. You can keep measuring this from each of the nodes, noting that, of course, if I measure from a node where I don't land on a continent, then you can then you can land on the Ionian, will land you in the ocean. But let's see if we can go to the next one for now. So let's go back then 15. So if we go back 15, so we're going to say, okay, let's go back 15. This time let's go from the Ionian. So if I'm going back 15 from the Ionian, it's going to be a negative 15 from the Ionian. What would be the local distance? 15 minus 12 would be like 5 minus 3, which would be 5, 4, 3, 2. So it would be then, no, 15 minus 12 would be like 5 minus 2, which would be 3. Okay. So that would then be a 3 node away. Where did my cursor go? There it is. A 3 node away Ionian, and that would be a negative second modal half step, which you would think would be a negative third scale degree. That would be the second number, but we don't have scale degrees, so we have to call it a negative 3 node away and still call it like a major 6, which I won't get into how do we get to that, but that's what we did in the prior presentation. So I'm going to say then, now I want to say it's a negative 3 node away minus another 12, or minus another octave, or a negative 15 node away from the Ionian node, and then keep the local modal half-step distance backwards, which is a negative 2. So if I was to go backwards by modal half-steps, it would be 1, 2 to the Aeolian. So it would be an IA modal range, but going in the clockwise direction, or a 1, 6 modal range going in, the counterclockwise direction. But I want to go back 15. So if I went back 15, it would be 5, 10, 15. So here we have going back 15. So it's an AI modal range or a 1, 6 modal range. But now I'm going to say and a negative 12, giving me the counterclockwise direction as well as the distance of an added 12 in the negative direction. If I was to go forward, I can see, well, if it's a negative second modal half step, I can say 7 minus 2, 7, 6, 5 would be 5 forward. So it would be a 9 node away from the Ionian node, 5th modal half step, which you would think would be the 6th scale degree. So now that actually works going forward from the scale degree side of things. 9 node away going forward. There's 5 nodes between there's a fault line, so it's 5, 10, and then 9. So we have, once again, an IA modal range. So we can then see that the IA modal range is going to be going forward. It's going to be an Ionian 5th modal half step, which would be the 6th scale degree, and going backwards, it's going to be a negative Ionian 2nd modal half step. And then we can see the total notes distance here, and then again we can compound it by adding the notes in front, which gives me the distance, allowing me the third dimension of like time, the octave. All right, let's go to another one. Let's say we go back 16 this time. So we're going to go back 16. So if we go back 16, let's say we're going from the Phrygian, let's say if we go back 16. So, and so that means that we're going to go negative 16 from the Phrygian. What would be the local distance? 16 minus 12 is 6 minus 2, 6, 5, 4. So it would be a negative 4 from the Phrygian, negative 2nd modal half step, which you would think would be the negative 3rd scale degree, but we don't have 3rd scale degrees, so we have to just shoehorn that name in, which we talked about how to do in a prior presentation. So the local distance would be a negative 4 notes away from the Phrygian node, negative 2nd modal half step. So 1, 2, 3, 4, it would be then a PI modal range, but we're going counterclockwise, or a 3, 1 modal range going counterclockwise. But I want to go negative 16, so I want to say it's negative 4 and another octave, or negative 4 minus 12, or negative 16, and then I'm going to keep the local distance in modal half steps, negative 16 from the Phrygian node, negative 2nd modal half step. So, and then again, if I want to get the total modal half steps, I can say it's negative 2nd plus 7, negative 9 modal half steps backwards. But this second number will help to keep the flavor of it, I believe. So I can say if I go 16 back, it's going to be negative 5, negative 10, negative 15, and then this is going to be 16. So there we have it going backwards. So 1 octave, the second octave. So I'm going to say that's the modal range of a pi, but now it's a -12, giving me the direction counterclockwise as well as the octave negative. If I go positive, if it's the -2nd modal half step backwards, 7 minus 2 will get me the going forward distance, 7, 6, 5. It would be 5 forward. So it's going to be an 8 note away from the Phrygian node, 5th modal half step going forward, which would be the 6th scale degree. So now the scale degrees, of course, work going forward. So if I go 8 notes forward, it'd be 5 notes between because of the fault line, 5, 10, and then I can't get there because how many notes am I going? I'm going 8 forward. I don't have enough space. So if I went here, it would be, do I not? It would be 5, 10, 9, 8, backwards. What am I talking about? It'd be back here. So once again, it's a pi modal range that we have going forward. Now, note going forward, we have a different name, but that's a perk. That's a good thing, not a bad thing, because I should have a different name around the node as I'm going in a forward direction around the block versus a backwards or negative direction around the block. Otherwise, I have to just remember these distances that don't really tell me anything about distance, right? I have to just kind of memorize the terms. All right, let's go to the next one. So now we're going -17. So this one, we can measure that from the Ionian node, -17. So we're going -17 from the Ionian node. What's the local distance? 17 minus 12 would be 7 minus 2, 7, 6, 5. So it would be a -5 distance from the Ionian node, which is a -3rd modal half step, which you would think would be the -4th scale degree. If there were scale degrees, there aren't. So we had to kind of shoehorn that term in, which we won't get into now because we talked about it before. That means that if I went 5 notes back, which could be this one, 5 notes back would be here, would be the local distance, -5 note away, Ionian -3rd, or you could see it this way, 1, 2, 3 would be here, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But I want to go -17, which is -5 minus another 12, or -5 minus another octave, or -17 Ionian. But I'm going to keep the local negative modal half step back 3rd for the flavor. So I'm going to go then 5, 10, 15, 16, 17. So we have the modal range of an IX modal range. But this one, I'm going IX counterclockwise direction minus another 12. Or I can call that a 1-5 modal range and another 12 to distinguish the modal range between these two and these two. Notice if I just say it's an IX modal range, I could be going clockwise or counterclockwise. So you could put like a negative or something in there and a negative or something to indicate that it's going to be a negative direction. But that's going to be that. Now, if I went forward, then if it's 3 modal half steps negative, 7 minus 3, 7, 6, 5, 4, it would be 4 going forward. So with regards to the Ionian, that would be a 7 note away from the Ionian node 4th modal half step, which would be the 5th scale degree, which we typically call a 7 note away perfect 5th. So going forward 7 notes away, this would be 5 right here, 6, 7. So going forward, I can call that then a 7 note away from the Ionian node 4th modal half step, or 5th scale degree. Going backwards, it's going to be then local distance, -5 note away from the Ionian node, -3rd modal half step in the negative direction, and then an octave up, -17 from the Ionian node. I'm still going to call it the local distance, -3rd modal half step. I could compound it because now I measured it properly, so we could say it's 7 minus 3 or 7 plus 3, 7, 8, 9, 10, -10 modal half steps backwards. We'll talk about compound intervals in a future presentation though. All right, let's go -18. -18 is a weird one. We're going to get, so let's go from the Locrian. Let's try to find a Locrian over here. Let's try this one. I'm not sure it'll be perfect, but let's work with this one, and we'll go all the way to the right to the Locrian. So we're going to go -18 from the Locrian. What's the local distance in the negative direction? It's going to be 18 minus 12, or 8 minus 2, 8, 7, 6. So it's going to be a -6 from the Locrian, -3rd modal half step, which you would think would be the -4th scale degree, but we don't have scale degrees going backwards. So we end up with this, which we talked about how to do in a prior presentation. So what I want to do though is go 18. So if we start off with 6, can I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? That would get me here. That would be a NY modal range, and I'm going in the counterclockwise direction. But I want to say it's -6 and an octave, or -6 minus another 12, or -18 from the Locrian node, keeping the local distance for modal half steps -3rd modal half step. So if I go -18, can I do that? That's going to be 5, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. We can. So there we have it. So those are both going in the negative direction. They both are going to have an NY modal range, but the second one I'm going to say is an NY and -12, or a 7, 4 and -12. What if I went in the forward direction? You can see that we have an NY right here. What's the distance? It would be 5 and then a 6 going forward. Why? Because if it's -3 backwards in the modal half steps, it's going to be 7 minus 3, 7, 6, 5, 4 going forward. So that would be a 6 node away from the Locrian node 4th modal half step, which would be, you would think, the 5th scale degree. Now, no, you can get kind of mixed up between this one to use the diminished 5th or an augmented 4th. We don't have so much of that as a problem if we were to use this system, right? Because these will be relative to the node that we are measuring from. So there is going to be that one. Let's say we go back then 19. So now we're going to go 19 in the negative direction. So let's go back from the Ionian this time. So if I go back from the Ionian again, 19, it's going to be -19 from the Ionian node. What's the local distance? 19 minus 12 would be 9 minus 2, 9, 8, 7. So we're going to be going 7 back from the Ionian node, which is a -4th modal half step, which you would think would be the -5th scale degree, but we don't have -5 scale degrees, so we had to call that local distance a negative perfect 4th, which we talked about how to derive last time. But what I'm going to say, it's a -7 from the Ionian. So if I go -7, we can go up. That would be 5, 6, 7. So it's going to be a IY modal range. So it's an IY, but we're going counterclockwise, which would be a 1, 4 modal range. But I want to add another 12. So it's going to be a -7 plus an octave, or a -19 from the Ionian node, keeping the local modal half step backwards for the flavor, which would be the -4th modal half step. So we're going 19 back. It's going to go -5, -10, -19 back, -5, -10, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, -15, 16, 17, 18, 19. There we go. All right, so there we have it. So that's going to be an IY and a -12, or a 1, 4 and a -12 to distinguish it, even though we have the same 2 nodes involved, which will give us a similar flavor. If I was to go forward, if I went back 4, then I could go forward 7 minus 4, 4, 5, 6, 7. That would be 3 forward. So I'm looking for the second number being 3, 4. That would be a 5 node away from the Ionian node 3rd modal half step, which would be the 4th scale degree, which we typically call a 5 node away perfect 4th. So I can go 5 notes forward from here. There's 5 because of the fault line. We have to go diagonally. There would be 5 notes away right there. So, and we can also, of course, go an octave up from that. So we can, if I keep this second number the same, I'm still looking for an Ionian 3rd, but the 5 plus 12 going this way, by the way, would be a 17 note away Ionian 3rd modal half step, which would be a 17 note away, perfect 4th scale degree. So now I can name that going forward and be able to identify the forward direction and the backwards direction. Let's do another one. Back 20. Let's go back 20 from the Ionian nodes. Let's go from this mode. And so we're going to say, all right, I'm going back 20 from the Ionian. What would be the local distance? 20 minus 12 would be like saying 10 minus 2, or 8 back. So we're going 8 back. That would be 8 back from the Ionian mode, which would be a fifth modal half step, which you would think would be the -6 scale degree if we had scale degrees, but we don't, so we have to use that, which we talked about how to get to in the prior presentation. So if I went the local distance back, it would be -8 back, or -5 modal half steps. So that's going to be -5, 6, 7, 8. So that would be an IP modal range, but we're going counterclockwise. So it's an IP modal range or a 1-3 modal range. But I want to go another octave. So it's going to be -8 and or plus or minus another 12, or -8 minus another octave, or -20 Ionian. And I'm going to keep the local distance of -5th modal half steps backwards. So 20 back would be 5, 10, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, just barely fits there. So once again, an IP modal range counterclockwise, but I'm going to call it an IP and a -12 to show that extra octave, or a 1-3 and a -12. It's a -20 from the Ionian node, -5th modal half step. What if I was to go forward? Well, I could take the 5 minus 7, or 7 minus 5, 5, 6, 7 would be 2 modal half steps going forward. So that would be a 4 note away from the Ionian node, second modal half step, which would be the 3rd scale degree, which would be a 4 note away major 3rd. So if I go 4 notes up from here, this would be 5 going this way, and then 4 back here. So that would also be an IP modal range, but this one would be going clockwise versus counterclockwise. So notice this terminology gives you the directionality that we're missing in the other terminology. So next one, let's go -21. -21, and let's take it back from let's say we go back from a Phrygian. So let's go back from a Phrygian. And so we're going to go back 21 from the Phrygian. Where is the Phrygian? Here it is. So 21 back. What's the local distance? 21 minus 12 would be like saying it's going to be 11 minus 2, which would be 9. So it would be a -9 from the Phrygian. It would be a -5th scale degree. I mean, -5th modal half step, which would be a -6 scale degree if we had scale degrees. We don't. So we just have to use a -9 minor 3rd, which we talked about how to get to in the prior presentation if you're using that system. But if I go the local distance then of a -9, then that would be -5, -10, and then 9. So it would be then a PX modal range. So we're talking about a PX modal range or a 3-5 modal range going in the counterclockwise direction. But I want to go a -9 minus another octave, -9 minus 12, or -21 from the Phrygian node, -5th modal half step, the 5 being the local distance, the 21 being the total distance in notes versus modal half steps. So if I go at 21 distance, it's going to be 5, 10, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. So we still have the PX modal range counterclockwise, but I'm going to call it a PX and a -12, or a 3-5 and a -12. What would be the clockwise direction? It would be then 7 minus 5, or 2 modal half steps going forward. By the way, you can still count the modal half steps by when you go from string to string, because you can count the distance between the notes. So if I was to go down a string, we said there's a 5-note distance usually, except for this one. So if I go back to this node right there, those two are basically the same note. So if I wanted to count up, I can count from here, there, and count up. That could help me to count, the actual notes, the nodes that are in the system. So you can count node-wise or note-wise, whichever you'd like to do. But in any case, what did we say? If I went 5 modal half steps back, 7 minus 5 would be 2 forward. So we're going to say that would be wait a sec. Hold on a sec. 5, 6, 7. Yeah, here it is, 2 forward. It would be 3 note away from the Phrygian node, second modal half step forward, which would be the 3rd scale degree, which we would call a 3 note away minor 3rd typically. So if we go 3 forward, we would say it would be 5 notes between here, 5, 4, 3, back to here. And so that's going to be, once again, still a px modal range, but now we're going up in pitch. Notice it looks like I'm going backwards, but I'm not, because I'm going up in pitch because those are 5-note distance between the strings. So if I went back from here to here, these two are the same notes. So if I want to count the nodes up, I can say I'm going from this node, which is equivalent to this node, which is 1 2. It's 2 modal half steps up, which would be the 3rd scale degree if I made this the 1, and it's going to be 5 4 3 notes. I get that right? Yeah, I think so. Okay, so now let's go back 22, and let's take this one back from the good old Ionian. So let's see if I can pick an Ionian up here. Is that going to be far enough away? Let's try it. So we're going to go 22 back from the Ionian. So there's the Ionian. 22 back. What's the local distance? It would be 22 minus 12, which would be like saying it's 12 minus 2 or 10 back. So the local distance would be 10. So we're going to say that's a 10 note away, or a negative 10 note away from the Ionian node, negative 6 modal half step, which would be the negative 7 scale degree, but we don't have scale degrees, so we have to call it a negative 10 major second, which we talked about how to get to in the prior presentation. So the local distance would be a negative 10 Ionian negative 6 modal half step. So if we went negative 10, it would be 5, 10 in the negative direction. It would be an ID modal range going counterclockwise direction, but I want to go 10 minus another octave, or minus 12, or negative 22 Ionian, and I'm going to keep the local modal half step of negative 6 modal half steps. So can I go 22? I don't think so. It's going to be 5, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. No, let's do it from here. So it's going to be 5, and then this tectonic plate moved to the right, so it's got to go 5, and then 10 backwards this way, and then 15, 15, 20, and then 21, 22. So there, that gets me there. So that's going to be the distance from this node backwards. Okay, what if I was to go forward? Well, if it's 6 modal half steps backwards, 7 minus 6 would be 1 modal half step forward. So let's go down. That would be a 2 note away Ionian first modal half step, which would be the 2nd scale degree, which is a 2 note away major second. So if I go 2 notes forward, let's go from here, then I can go to this one right here, which once again is the ID modal range. So if I go to the furthest one back from here to here, I'm going to say that's an ID and a negative 12, or a 1, 2 modal range, counterclockwise direction, and an octave difference, or difference between them. All right, let's do the next one. Now let's go back 23, and let's see, we're going to go back. Let's try from the Phrygian this time. 23 back from the Phrygian. So I'm on the Phrygian, 23 back from it. What's the local distance? 23 minus 12 would be like saying it's 13 minus 2, which would get me to an 11 distance backwards. That would be a negative 11 from the Phrygian node, which would be a negative 6 modal half step, which you would think would be a negative 7 scale degree if we had scale degrees, but we don't. So we just call it a negative 11 minor second, which we talked about how to get to in a prior presentation. So if I go back 11, that would be the local distance. So I'd go 5, 10, and then 11. That would be a PY modal range, or a 3, 4 modal range, although we're going in the counterclockwise direction. I want to go, however, negative 11 minus another octave, or negative 11 minus 12, or negative 23 from the Phrygian node, keeping the local distance and modal half steps of the negative 6th modal half step. See if I can get there. It's going to be 5, 10, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. I could do it. There it is. So there we have it. So now I'm going to call that distance. It's still a PY, but I'm going to say it's a negative 12 and a negative 12, or a 3, 4 modal range and a negative 12. What if I went forward? Well, if I go 6 modal half steps backwards, and notice I went actually to this note, not 6 modal half steps backwards. We went 6 minus another 7, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, if you wanted to count out the modal half steps. And the way to count out the modal half steps is again, you can see the difference between the strings and try to figure out the modal half steps. I'll get into that in a future presentation, but for now I'm going to keep that as the local distance. And then I can say 7 minus 6 would be the first modal half step. I'm looking for the first modal half step going forward. So it would be the first one note from the Phrygian node, first modal half step, which you would think would be the second scale degree. And so we have here a 1 note away minor second. So if I go 1 up, then I can go from the Phrygian to the Lydian. Once again, it's a PY modal range, but we have the difference that's going clockwise, these going counterclockwise. All right, so then we could keep on going up 2 octaves back. I won't keep on doing it, but notice you can go more than 1 octave. We can't go too far on the guitar because we're gonna run out of space, right? But let's check it out. I'm gonna get rid of all this. Let's see if we can move this down here for now. And then, so we could then, of course, go back 24 steps. So if I go back 24 steps, then I can see that that is 12 plus 12. So it's going 2 octaves in the negative direction. So if I take 24 minus 24, that's going to give us something like if we look here, a 24 Ionian node from the Ionian node, 0th half step backwards. That would be the local distance. So that would be like saying it's a 0 to 0, but we're going 2 octaves back. So if I went to the next one back and we say it's negative 25 backwards, then 25 minus 24 means that we went a local distance of 1 modal half step backwards. So a negative 25 from the Ionian node, first modal half step, would be from the local distance a first modal half step back, Ionian node, from the negative first modal half step going forward then would be an 11 note away from the Ionian node, 6th modal half step, or the 7th scale degree. So one more here, if we went back 26 modal half steps backwards, if I do that from the Dorian mode, and we say then 26 minus 24 to 5, 6 would be a local distance of 2 from the Dorian node. Negative 2 from the Dorian node would be the negative first modal half step, and if I was to go forward, 7 minus 1 would be 6. So that would be a 10 note away going forward from the Dorian node, 6th modal half step, which would be the 7th scale degree, which would be a 10 note away minor 7 that we would have to apply to each of these if I was to use that method. All right, and then we can keep on going up in theory indefinitely, but in practice, on a guitar at least, we have, of course, limited space. So we only have to go so far. You can think this is going crazy. I'd have to memorize all this stuff. You don't really have to go that far, but then of course we can apply that and see the pattern on the fretboard, and then we can also see it and actually count it out in a more logical fashion, being able to actually count it both ways using the modal half steps directionally, clockwise, counterclockwise, and be able to go past an octave.